Good evening. Tonight's lecture is about a journey. You may think that the goal of the journey is self-reliance and inner quietude. It's actually a good assumption since that's the title of the lecture. But I want to stress at the very beginning that these are not static goals. It isn't as if there's some place within us where we can find something called self-reliance and inner quietude, and it just stays that way. These are things that ever increase. We have to continue to pursue them. And one of the terrific ironies of life, one of its pleasures, if you look at it the right way, is that as we pursue them, we achieve levels that are helpful for a particular point in our life, and then all of a sudden they're not enough anymore. Now some people get very tired thinking about that, and they come off with the kinds of statements that you hear like, when is this long journey going to end? I'm really tired. I keep thinking I've reached the goal, and as soon as I think I've got it in my hands, it's gone. As you can see, that's a problem of focus. If you're looking for a place to rest, let me assure you, you're not going to find it in this plane of existence. We're not here to rest. You get some sleep, you get some pleasant experiences, and if you're real good, you get some mystical experiences to recharge you, and that's about all you can hope for. As far as any deep, abiding rest, that's not available to embodied human beings. If you're looking for it, you're looking for it for a very simple reason. That is that you haven't centered yourself. Now, what I mean by that is that there are degrees of energy. All of us have a degree of energy within us that we can contact that is so deeply serene and peaceful that it is a kind of rest to us, the aforementioned mystical experience. But we have to be able to reach that place. If we can't reach it, if we can't even reach the place of restful sleep, which many of us unfortunately cannot reach, then we can't deal with the energy demands made upon us on a more basic level in our just day-to-day living. So what you have to begin to think of is the consciousness as a kind of sliding scale. Emerson used to like to say that there was no dividing line between the human being and God. There was no place where you said, that's me, and then if I step over that line, God. It doesn't work that way. To him it was a continuous ratio, a continuous relationship. And it was simply a question of how deeply you could sink into the depths of yourself. The deeper you sank, the more that you felt a godly presence. But that godly presence was around you all the time. It's simply that your attention wasn't fixed on it. So in a sense, what our lecture is about is attention. And we'll tie that into the conceptions of self-reliance and inner quietude, particularly in the aspect of finding a place in the world that we can function with and making it work. Finding a way to serve, in other words, and also to grow. The first thing we need to pay attention to, though, is just how important attention is. It's very odd that in our culture it's given very little attention. We lavish attention on things that don't deserve them, never really noticing it. We sometimes do things out of a desire for attention. We don't realize it. We think that we're in love. We think that we're hungry for something. We think that we need it, and all we really want is some attention. It's a need very similar to the need to be loved, or the need to eat, for that matter, or the sexual drives. It's a very primary aspect of the human being, and I would suggest it's a primary aspect of at least observably animal life, and perhaps by analogy, all realms of being on this world. You certainly must have, if you've ever had pets, known them that when they want attention, they get it. They know how to go about getting it, and they really don't care if you're giving them the attention by spanking them with a newspaper because they just clawed up the couch. They'll take that kind of attention if they have to. But if they can get petting, that's better. And I always think that it's not really the petting that feels so good. It's the fact that all your attention is fixed on the animal. They're kind of soaking in it. But we like to feel the same way. We like to feel that there's at least somebody in our lives that's paying attention to us. And then again, we like to go out and spend attention on other people. And there are unquestionably people here tonight who are here not because they want to hear a lecture or have something specific that they need to find out, but because they felt like paying attention to something. And this was the kind of thing that attracted them. Now that's all fine, except if you can get control over it so it doesn't control you, you can live much more functionally, much more balanced, much more enjoyably. So let's talk for a while about the kinds of things that people can lay their attention on. In our culture, a tremendous amount of attention is placed on being successful. And there are various ways of defining that. To some people, being successful means that they have a lot of money. And the interesting thing here, of course, is that you have sliding degrees. What is a lot of money to one person is not a lot of money to another person. Some people think if they could just have $100,000 in the bank, all their dreams would be satisfied. And there are other people to whom $100,000 is a pittance that wouldn't even begin to realize the kind of dreams that they have. It's very important to notice this, as obvious as it appears, because this function is something that we can use, this function of relative meaning. Watch a lot of television, see a lot of movies, talk to a lot of people, read billboards as you drive, and what you run into time and time again is this image of what it means to be successful. And sometimes, I would even say very often, we don't bother to analyze the image that we've accepted. And as a result, you get a workaholic. Not the kind of workaholic who's dedicated to realizing a dream and therefore spends tremendous amounts of time realizing it, but somebody who just works and works and works and doesn't really know why, doesn't know what they're after. They get things, they become wealthy, they become powerful, and they're still working and working and working, never satisfied. The idea of success has not been defined. Now, another form of success in our culture is popularity. And popularity is measured in different ways. Popularity can be having as many members of the opposite sex you consider attractive around you as humanly possible. On the other hand, for some people, it can be having as many important VIP people around you. Again, relative. We can choose. So how do we deal with at least these two aspects? Let's pause here. How do you decide where you place your scale? It's really very simple. What you're looking for is optimum function, optimum flexibility. You want to have the kinds of ease that luxuries can give you, even the kinds of pleasure, but you don't want to trade that for a chain around your neck. So you need to look at yourself and say, what do I really have to have? What do I really want? And analyze it very carefully and very sincerely and very honestly. Sometimes it's very surprising. For example, there are people who live in Los Angeles who work extremely hard to realize enough money to buy a house up in the mountains, maybe up in the Hollywood Hills or even up in Brentwood, something like that. And the way they're thinking is this: I've got to get out of the flats. Absolutely driving me crazy. No gardens, everything's on top of itself. Got to find somewhere where there's some air I can breathe. So they work and they work and they work to get enough money, and sometimes they buy the house when they can't afford it, and they wind up having the house and having so many worries and so much catastrophe that they don't enjoy the open air. And never thought, maybe I should move out of the city. Figure out a way to continue the kind of work I want to do, but do it elsewhere where I can live that kind of life and not take on the kinds of debts that destroy my ability to function. That's a simple example of this kind of logic. Like an example would be, for instance, the use of the computer. Many people who write feel that they need to be in this area, establish themselves in this area, and then never leave, even though at some point they said, once I get established, I'm out of here. They forget. They keep thinking they've got to be here and stoke the fires and keep it going. When what they could do is go live in Oregon or Wisconsin or London for that matter and type stuff into a computer and put a telephone in their little computer hookup cable and let their new book print out in their publisher's office. Happens all the time. But you have to know about these things. You have to make an effort to realize, in other words, just what conveniences and luxuries you really need. Very often, there's a kind of bridge luxury, I call it. You've got a television set. You like to watch television. And the problem is that there's nothing good to watch on television. Once in a while you see something you like, but in general you get home, you've got all these stations, there's nothing on, it's very boring and sometimes depressing. So you think, well, I'll get cable. So you go out and you get cable, and you quickly discover that cable is more of the same. Now you've got 30 channels of nothing to watch at the same times. And so then you decide a VCR, and I'll buy some movies. And of course you tire out the VCR. Now if you'd begun at the very beginning and said, maybe I better find a higher quality of entertainment than television, so that when the couple things that are worth seeing are on, I can just turn those on, and the rest of the time I find something else to do, whatever it might be, even flying a kite. Something more productive, something that I can still completely relax doing. Well, you've saved yourself not only a lot of expense, but a lot of running around and a lot of potential heartache as you think about how terrible the media is and how it is a mirror of our society and all those kinds of things. Another example of trying to become more aware of what your true needs are and of how you can best realize them. This is not really a question of being methodical, it's a question of being creative, of trying to puzzle out the best ways to do things. In general, if you are finding yourself required to do something that is just tearing the guts out of you, you're constantly exhausted, simply cannot maintain the activity, guess what? You're doing something wrong. Either you shouldn't be doing the activity at all, or you should restructure the activity. Find a way to make it less draining. One of the things that very often happens to us when we're attempting to deal with a situation we find, draining, is that we look at the people in the situation, or we look at the structure of the situation, and we say, can't make it work. These people are obnoxious. Structure just won't change the way I see it changing. Now, if you think for a moment, what you'll notice is it's not the other people who are draining you. It's not the structure that's draining you. It's you who are draining you. Your emotions about the situation, your expectations, you're mulling over it late at night, you're getting angry about it, you're talking about it endlessly with other people. That is what's draining the energy. And very often, if you simply remove focus from it, if you say, yeah, it's terrible, first chance I get, I'm going to get out of it, but in the meantime, I'm going to only give the minimum attention I need to do it well, and find something else to do that really fires me up. For example, in ancient Greece, you didn't have the kind of professional poets, this sort of thing that you have now, professional artists. You had craftsmen, you had people who were dedicated to some form of art. But in general, the idea was that if you were a poet, that's all. I mean, everybody is a poet, was the idea. And if you said, yes, but poetry is my passion, they would say, right, poetry is everybody's passion, but what do you do? And if you said, well, I can't hold down a job, I mean, can't be an artist and hold down a job, they would have laughed in your face. They would have said, well, what kind of human being are you? Got to do something for the society, something practical, something that doesn't take this kind of heartfelt thinking, perhaps. And then on the other side, you do your poetry, you do your art, you do whatever it is that brings you a sense of peace, a sense of joy. Very few people have hobbies or arts, talents that they can turn to as a release. If you live in this area, you have undoubtedly been in restaurants where you've run into waiters who are all going to be actors someday. And it's become a kind of joke among comedians. But it really isn't anything to joke about. It's an excellent example of the right kind of thinking. These are people who probably, if they were merely waiters, would be very depressed. They have aspirations beyond that. And so what they do is they devote most of their energy, most of their attention, and most of their desire to becoming successful actors, successful practitioners of their favorite art. But they also are able to hold down a job that they find at least somewhat genial, and as such survive in the meantime. Very few artists these days have that kind of foresight and that kind of discipline. Very unfortunate, particularly fine artists. And I will suggest to you that a mystic is the finest artist that there is. If you're on the spiritual path, if you're attempting to realize the presence of love or the presence of God in all things, you're an artist. And you will definitely have the temptation to withdraw from everything, to feel that, no, I can't do this job because this job isn't spiritual enough. There is some truth in that. if you have to lie in your job, if you have to hurt people in your job, if you have to do things that are utterly against the principles you know are right in your job, you shouldn't be there. You should definitely quit. Find something else to do, and have the faith that you will find something else, quitting for the right reason. It is imperative, however, that the mystic realize that contact with this world is extremely important. Why? Well, to begin with, you're embodied. If your great desire is to get out of the body, I've got good news for you, you will. You're going to die someday, and you will definitely realize that wish. In the meantime, there's absolutely no reason for you to repudiate material experiences. On the contrary, you should restructure them, reorganize them, begin to see the divine order in them, and most importantly, begin to see the mercy and the love in them. By doing this, you transmute the activity. If you pull away from it, then you are setting up a blockade within yourself. You might think to yourself this sort of equation. If it's happening, God is for some reason sanctioning it, whatever word you want to use there, the natural order, the law of the universe. And if you cut yourself off from that activity, saying either it's wrong or I do not wish to see this, you cut yourself off from an aspect of wisdom, an aspect of mercy, if you like. It's different to say, I don't understand this, it pains me, I don't see how it could be for the best, but I won't make a judgment about it. I will simply remain open and hope that someday I will have that understanding. Now, what I'm hinting around at is a different conception of self-reliance than what most of us think of. To most of us, self-reliance is, I have enough discipline, enough on the ball, enough connections perhaps, enough money to do exactly what I want to do. And that's the idea of self-reliance. I'm suggesting an entirely different form of self-reliance, a form which is constantly open to experience, constantly open to illumination, and that is open to caring and sharing with people. Not the image that we're given, the Horatio Alger thing of the tough guy who gets up there and he makes his way in the business world, that sort of thing. Not at all. A very different kind of self-reliance. Now, we talked earlier about the sliding aspect of human consciousness. It's been illustrated by the chakra system. I might hasten to add here, for those of you who are interested in the Kundalini and chakras, that the acceptable 7-chakra system is one of many, many chakra systems, and the numbers range from 3 to 5 to 7 to 22 and on up, so that it should be understood to be a very complex system with different levels that it can be perceived at. But at any rate, for convenience's sake, we can talk about 7 levels and talk about how consciousness can be associated to any one of those levels, as long as you remember that we're not talking about expressly 7, that there are infinite numbers of places where you can put your attention, where you can focus. There are people who focus on the lowest aspect of life in this universe, one that in astrology would be called Plutonic, one that in Hindu religion might be referred to the god Shiva. And this is the destructive aspect. And there are people whose lives are mainly characterized by their destructiveness. If you want to be really daring with your philosophy, you might say that people who go out and destroy the Amazon forest at a prodigious number of acres a minute are serving the Shiva force. We don't see the wisdom in it. It frightens us. But there's a reason why that needs to be destroyed, and it's being destroyed. In our own lives, it's more common to associate this with a kind of depression or a kind of sarcasm, a sense of looking out into the world and saying, this place is a mess. It's awful, it's ugly, everything's bad down here, and I can't see a single reason to exist except the fact that I'm here, and I don't know what else to do. That's a kind of destructive consciousness. The next level from that, again, for convenience's sake, might be called the productive level. And this is a kind of mindless productivity. These are the fellows who go out and they get an idea that nobody really needs, and before you know it, it's in 1 million households. It's simply the desire to be doing something when it's founded in an ideal, it can be a tremendous moving force in a society, create very beautiful things. Great artists, for example, are very hooked up into this energy. And it could be argued, and will be argued, that all the energy that's used on the higher levels of human endeavor are brought from this energy, the sexual energy. Whether it be the artistic, whether it be counseling or lecturing, or whether it be simply mystical experience, it is a libido, the life force energy rising up. Different from the destructive energy we discussed, which is a kind of renunciation or twisting of that into a kind of suicidal relation to itself, killing life in other places. This is the desire to create, whatever it might be. At its worst, it leads us kind of by the nose. We get lost. It's a thing that tells us we've got to go out there and have a great time, have great experiences. And a great time consists of drinking enough gin so that we pass out in the middle of the night and wake up with a huge hangover, not remembering who it was that we were chasing after, that sort of thing. But that kind of chasing after fun, although it has a very strong Shiva, destructive presence to it, is also kind of productive energy, the desire to experience. It can almost be said it's a desire for union of a sort, to have an effect on other people's lives, to have some form of contact with them. And again, you can see how this can resolve into a whole spectrum of possibilities. In a sense, this can be the motivation of a psychotic rapist. In a sense, this can be the motivation of the highest form of mystic, but they're very different applications of the energy. One is much more refined than the other. One is much more filled with the presence of light than the other. You move up from that level and you've got the, let's call it the possessive, the desire to have. Might be the desire to have a person, might be the desire to have things. Our culture is real big on this particular plane of activity. We're a consumer society. We like to have, to hold things. The important thing here to realize is that this is not merely a process of retention, it's a process of digestion. Very often, when philosophers want to poke holes in people's acquisitiveness, they say, you must realize you're only a custodian, that everything you own will pass through your hands, will eventually be owned by someone else, or simply will be destroyed, will decay. So you should never think of it as something you own, but as something that you have borrowed for a while. This is very effective, but part of the problem here is that you neglect the function of having it. And the function is digestion. And as long as you're digesting what you have, everything is fine. It's when you take too much and you can't digest it that you're in trouble. And I'll give you a very simple example. It's very common among metaphysicians, and that is books, the library. There's a tendency for a metaphysician to start out with a book. Knows somebody perhaps, hears a lecture, someone hands a book to them, read this, and it's the book that works, the book that opens them up. It suddenly makes them realize there's an order to the world, there's a reason to exist. And very often the metaphysician goes from there and says, well, I'll own every single book this person ever wrote. And I'll find out who influenced this person. I will then go out and try to own every single book that that person wrote. And it goes on and on and on until you've got thousands of books in your library, hundreds, whatever it happens to be that gluts you. And of course, you're no longer digesting. 90% of them aren't even looked at. You don't even know what's in them. Some of them you don't see at all. The ones that you do see, you always have a sense of guilt, this feeling of, I'm spending too much time with this book. There's that book. I should read that book. And of course, there's a dozen other books as soon as you pick up that book that are calling for your attention. Now, we do this with all sorts of things, with clothing. We do it with any kind of possession you can imagine. Get much more than we need and wind up glutted. Now, first of all, we're being incredibly selfish because if we have it, somebody else doesn't. And it's quite likely if we don't need it that somebody else does. So you might think, for instance, when you're thinking about your book collection, you may get to that wonderful book someday, but there may be somebody who needs it right now, and you're sitting on it for absolutely no reason. If you really need it, it'll be there when you need it, of course. And applying that rule into all aspects of life can very much help to relieve the possessiveness and the glut of having too much to pay attention to. And this can be understood in terms of experience, too. With most people, there's a problem with too little experience. We've talked about this many times. Finding the things that are the most comfortable, the path of least resistance, and sticking to it. Kind of walking along with it until you become so tired and so bored and so unaware that hopefully you wake up, or you run into some form of crisis that wakes you up, forces you to wake up. Some people never wake up, actually, from that kind of thing. But you do have other people, and particularly metaphysicians, who immediately expand and want to experience everything. You run into people who, for instance, they've been studying metaphysics for 2 years, and they're into this kind of, where are the initiates? Or where are my psychic powers? Or where is this? Where is that? How come so-and-so's only been reading for a year, and they've had a mystical experience, and I haven't had anything? That sort of thing. Completely wrong focus, completely off. We'll explain why in a moment. It relates to this conception of self-reliance, and very much to the idea of inner quietude. But moving on up our levels, we then come to a self-expressive level. This is again different from the desire merely to produce. This is the desire to produce from ourselves, to have ourselves recognized in some way for the form of expression. It can be associated in astrology with the Leo energy. This can be an artist's desire to write a great book that in some way gets across his or her philosophy of life. This can be somebody who paints paintings that capture their vision of the world. It can be people who get up and talk to other people about what they believe. This is, again, a kind of vehicle state of consciousness, and it can be judged, in a sense, by what is being expressed. We talked about how hideous most television programming is, and there's a very simple reason for that. The kind of self-expression is on, let's say, a less exalted level than one might wish for. There's many reasons for this. The major reason is fear. If you have any contact with the entertainment industry, you know that the prevailing emotion is fear, that everybody is afraid of getting fired, everybody is afraid of making a decision, and as a result, nobody does anything daring. And if you won't do something daring, you won't do anything brilliant. You won't do anything scintillating, anything fascinating. Let's apply that again into our own lives. If fear is ruling your life, fear of anything at all, you cannot unleash the energy that you have to give. The essential nature of that energy is love. Whatever form of expression, you give it. I'll give you a very simple example. Very often, in the lives of great mystics, we read reports by people who've had audiences with them. And of course, many people say, oh, the wisdom was tremendous. Just in a few sentences, this person answered my question and completely satisfied my doubts and fears. But more often than not, you don't hear that. Most people don't even remember what they heard. What they say is, there was just the most wonderful feeling around the person. I felt like safe all of a sudden. I felt like someone really understood me all of a sudden. I felt as though I was in the presence of a truly realized human being, and that therefore it was possible for me to become that way. And the real sharp ones, people like Sri Ramana Maharshi, will come out and say, well, yes, that's really what a guru does. The guru isn't there to teach you certain meditational techniques. That's all part of it. Those are helpful but secondary measures. The main thing the guru is there to do is just to be loved, to replace the people who didn't love you, and to be, even more important, an embodiment of God's love. So you get an impression of what it means to be a vessel of God's love, a tremendous equality, the ability to see anyone, apart from their bodies and their dress and their way they're sitting and all that, but to see the essence there, the essence of light that needs to be nourished by that emanation of love. The Sufis call it barakh. And they say that you really can't have a mystical awakening unless you've been blessed by the barakh of your teacher. And they talk about it passing from person to person as this foggy kind of thing. Anyone who is interested in Sufism immediately recognizes that these are, in general, Persian poets or influenced by Persian poetry, and therefore they love analogy and symbol, and they're going to confuse you endlessly with beautiful, wonderful poetic similes that eventually take you way off the track unless you're willing to see that these are all simply symbols, that the Sufis picking up every single aspect of life and saying, this is a good representation of spirit, and this is a good representation of love, and this is a good representation, etc. Have you ever looked, for instance, at Islamic geometric patterns on silverware, or on a rug. It's all got meaning. If it isn't a line out of the Quran, then there's some little geometric form. And if you know the secret language, it'll tell you a little story, perhaps the artist's experience at the time that they were creating the piece. Very interesting thing to study. Self-reliance, then, is freedom from fear. And the big question, of course, is how do we become free of fear? And that is inner quietude. We need to be able to reach that level. Before we go there, let's move on up to the next level in our 7. And we get up to what might be called the level of symbol. This is a sort of transitive state of consciousness. It's not necessarily exalted. For instance, mobile gasoline has an easily recognizable symbol. The idea is this is something that's form is a perfect representation of something else's form. Language is the best example of this. I can say a word, and you will envision something that goes with the word. That's the only way you can make sense out of what I'm saying, is you have enough pictures in your mind to put it all together and get the train of my narrative. First of all, most of us become tyrannized by symbols, by language. We forget that it is fallible, that it's a very useful tool. It's an incredibly facile tool, but it is also an incomplete and most imperfect tool. Therefore, any time that we're in a situation, a conversation, a discussion, a debate, or reading a book, for example, and we read something that horrifies us, we just say, this is wrong. We need to look at it and say, now wait a minute. First, am I reading it correctly? Is this what the author really intended? Now, you might expand that to a conception of creation. You might look around you and say, I can understand this and that and the other thing, but I cannot understand famine. I cannot understand Ethiopian children dying by the droves. And it makes me angry. And there are many people who are atheists because of these sorts of things. They say there's no way there's a God. God wouldn't permit this sort of thing to happen. Not stopping to ask themselves, am I misreading the symbol? There are 100 ways to look at that one situation. I've known people, for example, who looked at the plight of the Ethiopian children in a light that, to this sort of person suffering at the idea of it, would seem absolutely perverse. And that was, well, I think it's fabulous. It's quite obvious to me that these children who come in and die very quickly are simply discharging the very last bit of their karma. They don't need to be around very long, that sort of thing. There are other people who say everybody has a form of suffering to contend with. It is true that the children suffering as they are from hunger have a terrible pain to contend with. But if you were to take the complete life of your average American who sinks into boredom, depression, and complete lack of faith, and took the pain in that life and distilled it, and took the pain in the child's life, they would be equal. Different in quality, perhaps, but the intensity is the same. We all have, in other words, our pains to contend with. All sorts of different ways to look at it. If you're a believer in this world as Maya, you'll simply dismiss the whole thing as a phantasm and say, no, as soon as these children contact their true essence, then the entire thing is unfolded as a dream, they understand it, and they are benefited by it. These are just a few examples of how that kind of incident can be read. And anything that happens to you in life can be read that way, and personal disasters especially need to be read that way. Anytime something happens to you, or you see something that offends you, you have a challenge. Very few people are able to simply look at the situation and drop it, say that's the way it is, not going to think about it anymore. Instead, they take it home with them, and they ruminate over it. And what they often don't realize is that they have certain predispositions working. Your predisposition might be there is injustice in the world. That's simply the nature of it. There is pain, and I'm afraid of the pain. I don't want it to come to me. And if you begin with that idea, you will come out with a certain kind of conclusion when you look at a disaster in your life. Very likely a not very useful one. I guess what I'm asking here is for you to experiment with different postulates. Next time something happens to you that bothers you, anything at all, you see something on television, hear it on the radio, drive past it, it bothers you enough to impress itself on your thoughts, try to approach it with something else. Say, okay, I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to make an assumption that my initial reaction to this as being something unjust and painful is wrong. I'm going to try and see mercy in it. I'm going to try and figure out, even in the most torturous, imaginative way, how this might be good. And of course, if you've studied, especially Hindu religion, you'll have a million ways to approach that, all of them quite dandy for explaining to you why people suffer. But the idea here is to correctly read the symbol so that you can pass from the outside, the body of the symbol, to its essence, to its spirit. And not to a projection of your own fear, your own insecurity, your own doubt. We can move up to another level, which might be called psychic, although all of us live in it to varying degrees. This is just the realm of perceptions. It happens to us usually in very minute ways. We have dreams we don't remember. Later we have something happen to us and we have a sense of deja vu. We think, I think this happened. If you keep a dream journal, you quickly discover that sometimes you do predict, in a sense, the dynamic, if not the actual incident, and you get a sense of having lived through it before. It happens sometimes, for example, if you're watching sports. There are times when you watch a baseball game and you think this guy's going to hit a home run, and he hits a home run. And of course, you immediately laugh it off because it makes you nervous, and you say, no, that was just coincidence. You never, perish the thought, bother to keep a journal to see just how many times the coincidence happens, or when it happens, or why perhaps it might be happening. Or we have a sense that somebody's about to call, or the telephone rings and we think this is so-and-so. These kind of things happen all the time to us. We tend to ignore them in favor of the more glamorous forms of the psychic, people who can read our auras, who can tell us about past lives, who can tell us about all sorts of things that we can't even imagine how they do. And a lot of people make as their principal focus this desire to develop psychic power. They want to be able to see these things, and of course, 9 times out of 10, their desire to want it is precisely the reason why they don't develop it. They're blocked. And even more interestingly, if they got it, if they developed that power, they would probably go half insane at surprise that they got it, not knowing what to do with it. In all the great texts and all the great teachings, you're told one simple thing. As you do your spiritual practice, you will develop psychic powers. Ignore them. They're a means of distracting you from the path. And then finally, we reach what might be called the final level, the opening of the 1,000-petaled lotus, which I think is a beautiful image. It's been called cosmic consciousness. It's been called consciousness of the oneness of being. It's a direct apperception of the divine ground upon which the universe is built. When you have it, the world seems to flatten out in a sense, and you understand truly what people mean when they say that life on the material plane is a dream. It's usually an experience full of bliss, full of a sense of knowledge, of satisfaction, of kind of deep, deep serenity. However, that is not your goal. Here's the trick to all this. In general, as you go up those levels of being, you get the idea, well, you start down there and you wind up there. If you're fortunate enough to get up there, you suddenly discover, well, I'm up here. Now what do I do? At which time you figure out, I guess that wasn't really the goal. One of the things we talked about at the very beginning of the lecture, these receding goals. The trick is that you've got to balance all levels. You can't repudiate any one of them. You exist in all of them. You have to accept all of them. You have to learn to function on all of them. And most importantly of all, you have to learn how to keep them all open at once. Very difficult thing to do. Time, patience, and relaxation are very much needed to accomplish that. Let's try an experiment. Let's try and describe what happens to you when you have a mystical experience from the perspective of the immaterial instead of the material. First, very quickly, let's say you're moving along in your life and you're doing your various practices, whatever you find to be most balancing for you. All of a sudden, a mystical experience. Something really dramatic happens. Most people at that point drop everything. They totally focus on that. They try and remember it. They write it down. They try and get it again. They try and figure out what practice and what combination of things was the thing that produced it. And of course, the next thing that happens is, boom, land with a crash. And the whole process starts over again. Now, if you're looking at that from the perspective of your conditioned personality, you're saying, what did I do wrong? Isn't this the idea? Now, look at it a moment from the unconditioned. Here you are, little puppet, the personality. And after a long time, the puppet's finally been taught, maybe a dog is a better example, it's finally been taught, yes, roll over and bark when I do this, that sort of thing. And it does it. And the reward is a mystical experience. You open the little hole between you, the window, and let there be a contact, a union. And what happens? The dog goes nuts, starts biting its own tail, stops feeding itself, doesn't do anything it's supposed to do. All it does is kind of lay around in this ecstasy. Well, you realize from your position that the dog may be having a great time, but it's going to be dead any day now if it doesn't figure out it's got to pay attention to those things again. So you simply pull away awareness of it, thereby forcing the personality's attention back onto the needful things in life. Zen gives us a tremendous picture of this and the idea that even sweeping the floor must be made into a spiritual experience. The idea is that when you're doing the most menial labor, you're still open to the higher consciousness. And you realize that just because you've had an enlightenment experience doesn't mean you can't ever again sweep a floor. On the contrary, you should sweep it all the more carefully. We'll take a break and talk about this some more. I want to go back to the image of the slide rule. Picture the spine. And picture all the different areas on the spine as representing different states of consciousness. Just as a symbol, it's quite useful. And think of the slide rule going up and down the spine, and that you can place it wherever you want. First problem is most people don't realize they can place it wherever they want. It sort of slips around, they get bumped by things, and it goes up a notch, and then it falls down 2 notches, and they have absolutely no idea why, and they live most of their lives that way. Some people get the idea that you can move the thing around, but they only know about one level of it. And so, for example, you have the unfortunate circumstance of the neophyte metaphysician who immediately wants to experience cosmic consciousness and jump from the lowest possible form to the highest, not realizing that somewhere along the path they're going to experience all these other levels. And sometimes this becomes very painful, and it also becomes a way of losing touch with the original direction. A very simple example would be that all metaphysicians at some point have to deal with what might be called the sexual level of being. They've got to decide what their relation to that is going to be. We talked about that in a lecture, I think it was 2 weeks ago. Whether one is going to be celibate, whether one is going to be committed to a certain kind of sexuality, whether sexuality will be used as a spiritual practice, these kinds of questions will come up. Some, maybe because of training, particular kinds of sensitivities, become utterly derailed at that point. Most common are individuals who read somewhere that you cannot be a mystic, you cannot be self-realized, you cannot be anything unless you practice celibacy. That's the first thing you've got to get rid of. A good example where people often find this is Ramakrishna, who had, I think, a lamentable habit of coming out and saying, women in gold, when will men stop worrying about women in gold? And used to tell people, well, it's okay to be married, you can still become enlightened, but it's really much better if you're not. There are other mystics who I consider more profound from my own experience who say, no, on the contrary. Their answer to questions like, do I need to be celibate, is, you are God. You don't need to be anything. You simply need to realize you are God. Now, let's spend a moment on that thought. There's a wonderful story that I often tell about a Sufi mystic who got his name in history by walking up in front of a whole gathering of Orthodox Islamic scholars and saying just those words, I am God, I am Allah. And he got himself burned for it. He knew what he was doing, left us a little message. What do the words mean? The mystical path, the path toward self-reliance, is really the path toward reliance on God. And I use that word understanding that every one of you has a different conception of what I mean. Also understanding that there's no way that I can get across to you precisely what I mean. To some of you, God may represent creative force. To some of you, God is love. To some of you, God is mercy. To some of you, God is consciousness. To some of you, God is form, color, consciousness, and everything else that makes up the universe. And then there are Sufi mystics to whom God is everything, period. Some people have an abstract conception, the one. Some people have the conception of a bearded guy who's standing way up there. I had that one myself for many years. Makes it very easy to become an atheist, for example. In general, that idea is constantly changing, is constantly deepening. As you discover more about who you are, you discover more about what God is. Power of analogy, power of experience. But what does it mean when a person says, I am God, and is willing to be burned for it? They think it's so important that that be laid down in the history books, that one statement. What do they mean by that? They don't certainly mean that I, this individual standing here, am the omniscient creator of the universe. Yes, folks, your questions are answered. I created the universe. No, that's not what they meant at all. They didn't exactly mean either that they were somehow a special vessel of God. This is a terrific problem in the history of Christianity. One of the most paradoxical religions on the face of the earth. If you read your New Testament, you find again and again injunctions that make the practice of most modern Christians absolutely unchristian. Simple example, go and pray in your closet. Don't let the one hand know what the other is doing. 90% of your preachers on television are breaking those two right off the bat. Very paradoxical. When Christianity became a political force, it did something very interesting. It said, only one person can have contact with God. That person lived and died. The rest of us are completely out of luck. We can have a vicarious experience of God's presence and nothing better. Interestingly enough, a lot of this came out of Neoplatonism. The Christian church absorbed some of the Neoplatonic doctrine, especially, unfortunately, a misinterpretation of the idea that this world is evil. To the Neoplatonists, this world was difficult. It was a place of illusions, of mud, of mire, that you got caught up in and you forgot who you were. You became lost in the dizzy play of atoms in this world. But it wasn't necessarily evil. It was just difficult. And when the Neoplatonist practiced withdrawal from this world, he was not rejecting the beauties in this world. Wasn't talking about how this world's enticing, it's the devil's own game. As a matter of fact, the Neoplatonists did not believe in a principle of evil. They believed the universe was all good, that evil was only ignorance. If you didn't understand the world, you thought it was evil. And if you did something evil, it was because you were ignorant. But the church picked this up. They perverted it a little bit. They said, the body is evil. They said, the beautiful flowers, the mountains, all that stuff, evil. It's all Satan's snare. And the only person who can get you out of that is this one person who was born at this particular time because that one person was an emanation of the Godhead. A Godhead that is not immanent in this world. Now, the mystic who says, I am God, has, as you can well imagine, a very different perspective, and a perspective I would suggest to you is what Jesus really meant. Sufis, for example, despite the fact that they're Islamic, are constantly talking about Jesus as a very important avatar. In Islam, you find him referred to as a prophet, but among Sufis, they will say things like this wonderful quote by Rumi, that God gave blind men sticks so they could grope their way to a Jesus. And then he goes on to say, instead they beat themselves over the heads with them. The stick, of course, is intellect. When a mystic says, I am God, it's because the mystic is focusing on the immanence of God in all things. The so-called veil of unknowing is being rent. If you've studied your metaphysics, you continually have run into veils. The veil of Isis, the veil across the face of the high priestess and the tarot card. Veils on top of veils. The idea here is not that you're facing a mystery that cannot be seen through. The idea is that you have to simply move aside the veil. Before you can do that, you have to know where to go, what veil to move aside. And the big hint that's given you through all the traditions is know thyself. So it gives you a hint. The veil is in you somewhere. If you begin to play with that veil through the expansion of consciousness, you begin to discover something pretty amazing. And that is that the reason you don't know who you are or what you are is because you think you don't know who or what you are. It's the doubt itself that creates the situation. A prime example is that of people who perhaps have natural talent for a musical instrument. I know one child who had that talent, grew up in a family where he was told repeatedly, you can't have that talent. You can't play the piano unless you learn how to play the piano. You've got to go to teachers, and was promptly sent to teachers and never played the piano again. I know another child who was simply told, boy, you think you can play piano? Fine. They went out, got a cheap piano, and guess what? Child plays piano very well. No doubt. Simply the feeling, I can do this. If you look into your own life, if there are things that worry you, things you wish you could do, what's stopping you is very simple. The feeling that you can't do it. The doubt. And simple test in those situations. If you have tried to do the thing, if you can say to yourself with all honesty and sincerity that you have cleared out the worries, that you really sat down, you didn't say, well, I'm going to try this, but I know it's not going to work. But you got in there and said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to try it out. And you worked and you worked and you worked, and all of a sudden you were buried in mud. Well, you're right. You've bit off too much. You can try again. But in general, people don't even get that far. If they do, they impact the situation with all kinds of doubts and fears and worries and expectations of failure. And the first time they make a mistake, that's it. They're finished. Most people don't even go that far. They think about it. They say, boy, I'd like to do this, whatever it happens to be. But I could never do that. I'll never do that. No, I won't even try. I mean, why should I even try to do it? You should try experiments once in a while. Go out there, and if you have a friend who's doing something very laborious and they're really into it and this sort of thing, and you like it, you're interested in it, take a different assumption. Say to yourself, I can do that. It takes a little bit of patience. Read about the thing, whatever it is, a little bit. Watch it being done somewhat. But have fun with it. Just soak in the experience. Play. Don't make it into study. And next thing you'll discover is you can do it. I've been fortunate enough to know a poet who conceived an epic poem and then spent weeks talking about how, I'll never get this epic poem done. Take too long. I don't have the time to do it. Until one day there was this overwhelming desire to do the epic poem, and it was written in 2 hours. 12 pages of poetry, beginning to end, really fine stuff. Didn't even need to be redone, just came out nice. Someone might say, well, it's a psychic transmission, automatic writing. The poet does not agree. The point was that there was no feeling of this is impossible. There's a feeling of there's a desire to do it. There's a time to do it. The ideas are present. Let's go. Let's see what happens. Time is very elastic if you play with it. Very elastic. So you've got to remove the doubts and fears and begin to express the skills, the talents that have been given you to help people. That's really the main point of application. You're allowed to have fun along the way. You can, if you're a writer, you can write trashy stuff while you're learning how to write, that sort of thing. But somewhere down the line, there's a good cause for that skill, and it should be used well. The problem is that when people think about doing things for others' good, immediately you get this dour kind of a feeling, a sense of, oh yes, service. Think of sick people and starving and spoon-feeding burn victims and things like that. Not realizing that the people who do that in general, especially the ones who do it out of a sense of service, do it because they get a tremendous pleasure out of it. They like to do it. They feel good about it. It makes them feel good about themselves, makes them feel like they're contributing. If you think about it and it disgusts you to the pit of your stomach, it's simply not your style of service, not the thing you're called to do. And a very great irony here is that very often the one thing way down deep inside you wish could be the thing you were called here to do is exactly the thing you were called here to do. But somewhere down the line you were taught that it wasn't. Either parents or friends or school told you, oh, no, don't do this. This is bad. Only bad people do this. Or you'll never make a living at it. That's a big one. Or it's a very hard way to go. That's another one. Of course, not realizing that if it's meant for you to do it, it's not a hard way to go. It just opens right up. It sails. It's fun. Emerson used to say that finding what you're supposed to do in life is like being in a boat in a harbor. There's only one way to get out to open sea. And so all you have to do, if you don't have the awareness to look around you and see where the opening is just aim the ship around. You'll run aground if it isn't the right direction. And when you run aground, you take the ship out. And eventually, you'll find that a certain direction just keeps opening. For some people, it's several directions. You just keep flowing with that, keep sailing along that direction. The sinful idea of having fun on the spiritual path. I sometimes think that the most damage that has been done to mysticism and to metaphysics has been done by its proponents. And it hasn't been done by the ones that you might expect me to mention, the Aleister Crowleys and people who wrote these really bombastic books full of glamour and magic and violence and these sorts of things that tend to get people involved in the wrong aspects of metaphysics, but rather by people who are so serious about it. They'll talk about, after 6 chapters, bliss. They'll say, yes, and when you finally have the mystical experience, you have a sense of bliss. But the first 6 chapters were anything but blissful to read through. They were terrible, torturous, just terrible stuff. And you tend to find this a great deal with people on the mystical path, very serious. And the problem is that the tendency is for the ones who aren't serious, the ones who seem to have been a good time, they tend to be airheads. And you have many airheads on the metaphysical path, and I use the word with full comprehension of the astrological signification of it. People who are just kind of out there floating in their mental abstractions, often self-fascinated. And they can sometimes say things that startle you. They say all the right things. But you suddenly realize there's nothing behind. It's like air. You can just point right through it. Their actions are not in agreement with what they say. The motivations are not as they appear to be, that sort of thing. Very seldomly do you find some good old mystic who's down to earth and is able just to laugh, especially at him or herself. Most important person to be able to laugh to. We get plenty of practice laughing at other people without realizing that it's supposed to make us masters at laughing at ourselves. That kind of laughing at yourself, that kind of relaxation, is what dissipates fear. There are many ways to approach it. Some people approach the dissipation of fear through faith. Again, very difficult thing to accomplish. Unless you have been raised in a certain religious tradition or you've had a religious mystical experience so powerful that you're able to sink your claws into it and hold on. Faith is an abstraction to most people. They don't know what it means. They don't know how to make it work. Now, I'll suggest to you that faith and having fun and being aware of a sense of inner quietude are all really the same thing. Because what faith amounts to is the feeling that whatever happens is going to happen for the best. It's relaxing in the world. Most of us have a tremendous energy discharge going on all the time. And what it is the world should be like this, and it isn't. I want it to be like this. Well, we realize we can't do much to change the world. And then it moves inward. It becomes, well, my life is like this, and I really don't want it to be like this. And to aggravate matters worse, we project all kinds of fears and say, yes, but I don't want it to be like that even more. So there's all this mental energy being wasted. Criticism of what's wrong without any action toward fixing it. All kinds of anticipation of what's about to happen. If you look into the history of your own life, particularly if you've been practicing the mystic arts, and what do I mean by the mystic arts? I don't mean magic and alchemy and those glamorous things. I mean doing nice things, working on patience, overcoming anger. Keeping a dream journal is kind of nice. Perhaps a very simple form of meditation. Or a practice that Ramana Maharshi had that was really wonderful, which was the self-analysis, ultimate self-analysis. When you try to meditate, if you've been mistaught, you've been told, don't think, and you spend all your meditation time, oh, that one got by. And then you start to think about, I'll stop the next one. You realize that's a thought. You realize that's a thought, and all that sort of stuff. And then eventually you never meditate again because you can't stand it. Well, Maharshi had an interesting trick for that. You're supposed to do this. If you're sitting and you're meditating, all of a sudden you think, I really have to remember to do the laundry. And then you catch it. You say, who is speaking? Now, some people, that's all they need. As soon as they're out in the cosmos for a few minutes when they hear that one, because they don't know who is speaking. Where's that voice coming from? It's amazing. Now, if you have a really audacious mentality, it'll say, I'm speaking. And you say, well, who are you? And if it's sneaky, it'll say, you. And you say, who am I? And then it's gone. You just keep doing it until you reach the point where something becomes silent, whatever it happens to be. And if you really want to get tricky, you try this trick. You sit down and you say to yourself, well, okay, am I my body? Am I my body? Is that the essence of me? No. Million reasons why it's not you. One of the most basic is that you don't even know what you look like. How many people walk around thinking they're beautiful and everybody else thinks they're ugly? How many people walk around thinking they're ugly, everybody else thinks they're beautiful? How many people look in the mirror and say, when did I get old? I don't feel old. Why is the hair falling off my head? That's not the way I see myself. You're not the body. That's not where your essence is grounded. So then you go from there and you say, well, am I the emotions? And in our verbal culture, most people right away say, nope, no way, not the emotions. Because you're trained to get rid of the emotions or control them, that sort of thing. But even if you like your emotions, you can pretty readily say no, because the thought process and emotions are two separate and somewhat equal things. Then you come into thought, you say, well, am I thought? Certainly not. I mean, what is that inner voice that's constantly jabbering anyway? Ever have jingles pop up in your mind, that sort of thing? There's a little hint for people who have jingles popping up in their minds. Interpret the lyrics of the song. Find out what the song is and find out what the lyric for that part is, and you'll have a little message from yourself. It's sometimes very humorous. But still, where that's coming from is anybody's guess. Then you say, well, if you're a good Hindu, you've read your Ramana Maharshi and other, well, in fact, a good metaphysician of any sort, you can name about 1,000 things you're not. All kinds of different sensory perception, all sorts of different experience, mystical and otherwise. And you get around to the stuff, there's nothing left. And of course, that's the punchline. That's what you are. You're what's left when you take away all the things you can name. If you can name it, if you can isolate it, it's not you. It's a function of you. It's a part, but it's not the essence. One could say that what's left is simple awareness. It's the thing that unites all of that. What really unites the thought and the body and the emotion? If you've ever had an experience where you've got the three of them going in three opposite directions, you have an emotion of fear, the body has a desire for something, and the mind is giving a million arguments why this whole thing should be delayed. Nobody's in agreement with anybody else. What unites it? Awareness. There's a person inside you called a watcher. It's a good name for it. Just a part of you, a presence that's watching all the time. Doesn't get upset. Doesn't get killed. Doesn't get unhappy. Just watches. Some people have such a fine sense of the watcher that they actually become, unfortunately, mentally unbalanced because no one tells them what it is. They have this feeling of being watched all the time. Guess what? We're all being watched all the time. From inside. You may have felt this if you were once really depressed and you were sitting around and just enjoying the blackness of a good despair. And you knew you were. There was a little part of you that was kind of sitting on the side watching all this going, what a great performance, boy. Really wallowing in it this time. And it will really actually encourage you to get deeper into the despair, but you feel like, oh no, I'm really upset. And you dig further in, but you can't get away from that feeling that somebody's sitting there just nodding their head like, very well done. I like it. Better than last time. Same thing when you're real happy. Some people get this as a kind of depression. They're delighted, they're ecstatic, and they have this sense of, you shouldn't be this happy. Something bad's going to happen if you're this happy. But part of that is simply the watcher, a part of you that doesn't get involved. And you become so insecure that you feel like, what? There's a part of me that's not involved? That must mean something bad is up. Not realizing that this serene presence is just always there. It's there all the time. It's sort of what's there in your dreams, what makes dreams part of you. The only time that it seems to disappear is when you're in deep sleep. And yet, if you ask a person, if you say, well, how did you sleep last night? Did you sleep deeply? They say, oh, I had a wonderful deep sleep. So there's something going on there. There's some form of conscious presence, something enjoying it. It's able to imprint a trace of memory on your waking consciousness. It's not simply that you wake up and you feel better and that sort of thing, but you have a sense of deep sleep. And many of the great philosophers, Socrates, for example, used to love to say, well, if you're afraid of death, look at it this way. It's one of two things. If it's death, and that's it, nothing else, cut off, it's the closest thing to deep sleep. He said, and who is there that doesn't prefer deep sleep over anything? If you don't believe that, try doing what you like to do and not having deep sleep for about a week and see what you prefer at the end of that time. Socrates used to say that even the most powerful kings preferred their deep sleep to being rulers, that they'd give up their whole kingdom for deep sleep if they had to. So nothing to be afraid of in death, if that's what it is. In fact, it'll be quite pleasant. And if it's some form of consciousness, well, then it's an adventure. Then it becomes a whole different situation. And it's like, boy, what's going to happen? What will I see? What will I experience? And why? Back again to this conception of the mystic who says, I am God. He's referring not just to that part that we call awareness, the watcher. A lot of people say, that's it. That's the place where you and God are one. And then, of course, philosophers jump into that breach and they complicate matters terribly by saying, no, actually, that is the animus mundi, the world soul, or no, actually, that's the collective consciousness, or they come up with a million names for it to further confuse all of us. But that doesn't fully answer the question. The mystic isn't saying, I am this awareness, and this awareness is God. It goes further than that. It has to do with another little saying by the Sufi Rumi, which is that God is nearer to you than your jugular vein. Another little story to illustrate this about a man who rides on a donkey from house to house asking, have you seen my donkey? That's what most metaphysicians are doing. They're riding house to house, from book to book, teacher to teacher, religion to religion, saying, have you seen God? Have you seen my soul? Have you seen my donkey? And that's exactly what they're writing. They wouldn't be there if it wasn't for their soul, their spirit, their God. That's the presence, and that's the veil that needs to be rended. What is the cause of the veil? I'll hazard a response to that question. Most of us perceive the world through the five familiar senses. Some of us have some psychic flashes here and again, but we have our five senses that in vast preponderance give us the sense of what the world is. And when you tell people, oh, God is everywhere, most people say, oh, come on. They'll point out something and say, in that, huh? And they pick out the most disgusting thing around them and say, is that God? That sort of thing. Now, the senses are limiting. If you've ever gone out, for instance, to sightsee, you have undoubtedly come home later with a good headache or at least a sense of exhaustion. You've seen too much. There's a time when your eyes feel like they're going to throw up because they can't stand to see anymore. Same thing with hearing. You can listen to music and listen to it over and over and love and then all of a sudden it's, I don't want to hear any more music for a week, at least. So you can glut the senses. They have limits. In addition, they tend to report things inaccurately. Science has enabled us to see, for example, that the spectrum of light that the human eye is able to see is very minute. There's a lot more to see than we can see. Same thing with hearing. If you ever had a dog whistle, the dog hears that whistle, you don't. But that sound is there. We're simply deaf to it, another limit. So it could be said that the senses are like the aperture in a camera. They open and close to just let in a certain limited amount of whatever it is that they're tuned to, whatever they're focused on. That's their function. Their function is not to be wide open and take it all in. Their function is to limit, to cut off. And what they cut off are the things that you don't need to know about to survive. If you study biology, you find some very interesting examples of this. Frogs that have very bad vision. If you have bad vision, just think of the poor frog who's even worse off than you are. The frog can basically see just a little motion, a little light and shade, that sort of thing. But it can tell when a certain kind of predator is moving along. Just the very speed and shape, in a sense, of the movement immediately registers. That's all the frog needs to know. And we're sort of like big giant frogs. We need to know about a lot more. But generally, the only things we're alert to are the things that we need to know about, that make the maintenance of our physical life possible. So when we turn these limiting senses that are constructed to stop the infinitude of creation, to freeze it onto the world and expect to find God, we get disappointed because we see limits. The veil of unknowing, then, is our own sensory limitation. It's like turning a great big floodlight out into the darkness. Eventually, the floodlight will be swallowed in darkness. It won't be able to reach any further. Our senses are very much like that. If you do a little bit of logical thinking, if you read a little bit of science, you begin to discover, in fact, you don't even have to read science, you can read Huayan Buddhism if you want to instead, because they said it better than the scientists. You discover that the world is process, and the world is interconnection. Everything is in process. Everything is changing. Everything is becoming. There is nothing static in the universe, and there's two ways you can look at it. First, you can say nothing is static on a micro-macroscopic level by saying that this, which looks static, I can rest my hands on it, I can lean on it, actually is composed of millions of particles, just, incredible movement. We can't even imagine what's going on in here on a microscopic level, particle level. Another way to look at it, though, is that this lectern is in constant motion. It was originally a tree. I believe it's made out of wood. It was originally, before that, a seed. Stuff in the soil, sunlight, all the things that were used to make it the wood. And then the tree was cut down, and then it was perhaps formed into this lectern, and eventually this lectern will either be broken up or will decay and will exist in some other form. The only thing that permits us to say that it's the same lectern is that we're observing it as it moves through these different processes. But if I took a tree and stuck it right here, and a seed, and a little soil, and then a pile of sawdust, and said to you, this is all the same thing, exactly the same thing, you would say, well, no, I see how it's related, but no, it's not the same thing. It's almost like reincarnation. You could almost say that the seed is incarnated as the tree becomes incarnated as the flat wood becomes incarnated as the lectern finally becomes incarnate in dust and goes on to something else. Of course, it's even more complicated because we have to bring into it interconnectedness. Parts of the tree went to other things. Parts of the mineral went to other things. Parts of the sawdust that the tree becomes will split up into other things. So you have this tremendous interconnectedness. In Huayan Buddhism, they go far enough as to say that every single thing in the universe is connected to every other single thing. It's a massive mandala. And way up on this corner of the infinite universe, something happens. And way over in this corner, something happens as a complement to it. It's actually a law in physics now. So if you begin to study these things, you realize that your senses are fooling you, that everything's in flux, everything's in motion, everything is energy. And to further complicate it all the best, you have Einstein who comes along and basically in essence tells you that energy can convert into matter and matter can convert into energy, and therefore this is energy. This is consolidated light. It's light in a certain degree of existence. It's energy at a certain degree of vibration. But it's still energy, no different than light, no different than the force that you use to work your muscles, just a lot slower, a lot more stable appearing relative to us. Now that picture, the incredible interconnectedness and the constant process brings us a little bit closer to the idea that everything is God, everything is becoming. And we can jump across to a Hindu conception that's extremely useful here, and that is the idea that the universe is God realizing God. We all sort of take part in that as we realize ourselves at increasing degrees. You might say it's a series of dreams, or a well-thought-out poem, or a piece of music, whatever you like, but it's a way of self-discovery. In fact, take all the arts and multiply them by 1,000,000. You're beginning to get a little bit of a conception of what's going on here. That kind of creativity. That powerful, that intense. Now, where do we belong in all that? This is the beauty of it. We're not insignificant little dust motes. It's again this sliding rule conception. There are levels in which we are the universe. First of all, we're a universe in the sense that we're the universe of our body. And all the cells that are involved in our body, although they may not be cognizant of us, are living within that universe. And undoubtedly, there's a little cell down in your big toe that has absolutely no idea of your brain, let alone ideas of what thinking is or the fact that you walk around and go to the market to shop. The universe has its own meanings, and we have our own meanings separate from the universe, the cosmos within us. But also, a human being has levels at which there's a universal or cosmic consciousness, where you have a sense of the vastness, unlimitedness of eternity. So rather than picturing yourself as a little dust mote in the midst of all this, rather picture a ray of light coming out of the sun. Way far away from its origin, it's dimmest. There's the most darkness, the most absence in it, absence of light. But way up close, touches the very surface of the sun, full of light, brightness, heat. And you're always that, because if we were to put a little slide in and stop that ray an inch from the sun, all the rest of you would cease to exist. It's an open ray then. And each of us can be understood then as a ray of consciousness. And what we're attempting to do is to work our way back from the very outside limits of it toward its essence, the surface of the sun, perhaps even the center of it. And the contact is always there. There can be no beam without the sun. There can be no dim point of the beam without a brighter point. This is the essence of Neoplatonic metaphysics. Very complex logical arguments saying basically that inferiors must always indicate the existence of superiors. The person who says that the world is chaos without any purpose and without consciousness must be wrong, because form and order cannot emerge from chaos. Thought cannot emerge from unthought. Consciousness cannot emerge from the unconscious. This is the idea. But much more easy to remember is that sunbeam. And that idea of when we started out, we were projected out. And we had the experience of moving from the very hottest point of that beam all the way to the dimmest. And now we're moving back. Why, you might ask? Well, I've heard all sorts of reasons for that. I've heard that it's a joke, which isn't a bad reason if you think about it. I mean, it'd be kind of nice if all this was actually turned out to be the most hysterical joke that ever happened. God had a good laugh from it, and so did we. I've heard that it's a desire for self-knowledge on God's part, and therefore we, as we realize ourselves as a beam, are an aspect of the sun realizing itself, or of God realizing itself. It's possible it's just play. It's a nice way to think of it, too, that this is the way God has a good time. Is playing, setting up a dream world. The way, if you have ever watched children, they'll set up whole subcultures and games with certain rules and experiences, and they'll play role and act and have a great time. And I secretly think that most adults who watch them, particularly the ones who tell them not to do it because it isn't good for them, are really secretly wishing they could do it. And most forget. And I also think that the reason that actors get paid exorbitant amounts of money is because we look at them and say, now here's some kids who had the guts to stay kids. They still play act. A few other reasons that go on in there. It's a very godly kind of activity then. Yet, in the midst of all of this, there's a tremendous mystery. And it's tremendously important to be aware of that mystery. There's a tremendous Hindu story. You need everything tremendous here to get this across. About this, Maya is the Hindu term, illusion, the ocean of illusion, but also creation at the same time, in the sense that all creation is an illusion because it isolates certain parts of something to create something else, takes things apart to put them back together again, that kind of thing. The story goes that a Hindu sage worked very hard to attain consciousness of Krishna, God. And finally, having attained it, asked to be granted the answer to one question. Sometimes, by the way, it's not God, but the king of death. God said, Krishna said, yes, what is the question? I will answer it. And the sage said, what is the secret of Maya? What is the secret of the illusion of this world? Why is it so cloying? Why so difficult to get free of? Krishna said, I can't really answer that question. Maya is something that cannot be understood. The sage insisted. No, you said you'd answer the question. I want to know the answer to this question. Krishna said, well, all right if you insist. He said, but first, it's rather hot out here. India's very hot. Go over that hill. You'll find a small village. And get me a glass of water. I want to have a drink of water. Then when you come back, I'll tell you. Well, the sage is absolutely delighted. He goes ripping over the hill, sees a small town down there, picks out the nearest house and marches over, knocks on the door. The door swings open, and it's the most amazingly beautiful woman he's ever seen standing there. And her eyes are just full of love and a sense of surprise, as if she knows him, a sense of déjà vu. And he has the same feeling. Not only does he feel like he's known her, but it's as if here's the woman of his dreams. He's always known that somebody like this existed, and he's absolutely entranced. He forgets all about the drink of water and doesn't even know why he's there. She says, well, what can I do? And he says, I don't know. She says, why don't you come in for a moment and sit down? The heat, it's probably confused you. He comes into the house, and everything is just right. He loves the colors. He loves what he finds in it. It's the perfect environment. And her family is there. And old grandpa is sitting there, and he's saying, I told you he was going to show up. I had a dream about it. And the family looks at him, and they think he's a strappingly handsome, intelligent-looking fellow, and they're just absolutely delighted with the whole situation. And they kind of nudge each other because they can see the tremendous attraction developing between the favorite daughter of the household and the stranger. And he begins to talk and discovers that he loves talking with these people. It's fascinating. They say the most interesting things. They notice the most interesting things. And he decides to have dinner with them. And of course, one thing leads to another, and eventually he asks this girl to marry him. And she does marry him, and everybody's delighted. The whole village is just absolutely amazed. This is the greatest match. They're looking forward to the prosperity that such a fortuitous match is going to bring to the village, and such tremendous happiness and love these two have for each other. And as time passes, they have kids, wonderful, intelligent, fascinating children. His father-in-law dies, leaves the house, the farm, all the crops to him. He manages them beautifully, becomes fascinated with the cycles of the seasons and the way that the corn grows and calving the cow and all these sorts of things. Has the most beautiful life imaginable, becomes a sort of wise man in the village. Everybody comes to him for advice. And then there's a terrific shriek of thunder in the sky. And he goes out and he's never seen the sky so black. And he has this terrible sense of fear and foreboding. He doesn't know what to do, though. All of a sudden, a downpour begins. Rain pummeling the roof. And again, this fear becomes stronger. The children begin to cry. And all of a sudden, the roof is blown off of the building. And they're soaked in rain. He opens the door, and there's already a flood sweeping down the street like a river. Well, he picks up his wife in one arm, he picks up his two children in the other, and he starts to head out to where he knows there's some higher land. And the rain continues to pummel them. And as he's walking, he can't see. The children are crying. His wife is crying. He can hear people drowning around him. He can hear animals screeching. He slips. He lets go of his two children. This terrible stab of agony overcomes him, and he holds on to his wife, and he tries all the harder to forge to the higher ground. And he slips again, and he loses his wife. And the only thing that's keeping him going now is the sheer instinct for survival. He has no desire to live. He makes it to the stone, crawls up, and collapses in a dead faint. In the morning, he wakes up, he looks around him, and there's nothing but still water, as far as he can see in every direction. And remembering the beautiful life that he had and how it was all swept away, he just breaks down into hysterical tears, covers his face with his hands. And all of a sudden he hears behind him a voice that says, "Where's my drink of water?" And he opens his eyes, and Krishna is standing there in the middle of the desert. And Krishna smiles and says, "That is the secret of Maya." I'll leave you with that. Good night.